Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Genocide Research and Vicarious Trauma, a Self-Care Discussion. My name is Megan Reed, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director for the Zorian Institute and its division, the International Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. For those of you who are new to us today, the Zorian Institute is a nonprofit organization that raises awareness on issues related to genocide, human rights, and diaspora homeland relations through scholarship, research, and educational programs. Some of the Institute's most notable programs, publications, and collections include its annual graduate level Genocide and Human Rights University program, hosted at the University of Toronto. Its two peer-reviewed academic journals, Diaspora, a journal of transnational studies, and Genocide Studies International, both published twice a year by the University of Toronto Press. And its Armenian Genocide Oral History Collection, the largest collection of audiovisual testimonies of Armenian genocide survivors in the world. In recent years, the Institute has also expanded its work on genocide and human rights education at the high school level, offering in-class presentations, online resources, and educational supplements for educators. For more information on this work and other Zorian Institute initiatives, my colleague Kate will be sharing direct links to find out more in the chat, so keep an eye open for those. So today, in keeping with the Institute's mission of preparing the next generation of genocide scholars, we thought it would be important to offer our constituency of students, scholars, and researchers a public forum to shed light on the emotional toll that studying and working on genocide-related research can take on one's mental well-being. In today's session, our discussants will explore the causes and impact of vicarious trauma, and they will also offer suggestions for self-care and healthy research practices. You will have an opportunity to ask questions and share your own experiences and thoughts at the end of today's session in a brief Q&A session. So we encourage you to write down any questions that come to mind in the Q&A chat box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. During this Q&A session, you'll also be able to raise your hand and ask your question aloud. When you do this, we'll unmute you and you'll be able to speak and ask your questions directly. I will also note that the subject matter of today's session may be sensitive and personal in nature, so we will be recording this session as we believe it could be very helpful for those who cannot attend live. However, we may be stopping and starting the recording during personal anecdotes of our discussants, and we will also be stopping the recording during the Q&A to allow for open dialogue and a safe place to discuss personal stories. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker for today, Dr. Catherine Bishoping. Dr. Bishoping is an associate professor of sociology at York University in Toronto. Her fascination with research methods has led her from statistics to applied survey research, and then to qualitative approaches in sociology and beyond. Within genocide studies, Dr. Bishoping compared qualitative and quantitative approaches to studying Holocaust knowledge, analyzed a case of Holocaust denial in a university newspaper, and explored how the field would be transformed were genocides of Indigenous peoples to be analyzed alongside the 20th century genocides. As a university-wide teaching award recipient, she also addressed pedagogy and genocide and explored the phenomenon of vicarious traumatization and notable publications. Dr. Bishoping participated in a 2012 conference on trauma and secondary traumatization in studies of genocide and massive political violence held by the Hugo Valentin Center at Uppsala University, and contributed a chapter to the resulting book, Engaging Violence, Trauma, Memory, and Representation. Dr. Bishoping's current research focuses on qualitative methodology, particularly narrative analysis, uses of oral history interview data, and reflective explorations of awkward moments in qualitative interviewing. Today, she will be discussing some more personal experiences of vicarious traumatization and identifying certain contributing factors, as well as barriers to seeking self-care along the way. She will then be discussing approaches to self-care, including not only individual ones, but also organizational ones. So Dr. Bishoping, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're so happy to have you with us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. And thank you to the attendees for coming. I'm really honored to be asked to speak to you. As you'll hear from my presentation, this is a field that I have, for the most part, left, but I have the greatest respect for those of you working in it and hope that my story will be helpful to you. So let me share screen. So I was telling a friend about this webinar, and I said, back when I was doing genocide research, I would not have listened to a word I'd say today. I would not even have signed up to come to this. So my friend said, why don't you start with that? So there it is. I'll put that on the table. I'll be speaking to you about my experiences of vicarious trauma, in which through empathic engagement with other folks' trauma, we come to be transformed in our identity, our worldview, and our sense of connection to the greater, what we might call spirituality. So my time in the field, I'll be highlighting along the way certain personal and structural contributors to the vicarious trauma I experienced, as well as the beliefs that kept me from acknowledging this issue. I'll then turn to how one might reach people like my younger self who would not have wanted to listen, and to evidence-based research on what can do. What can be done, and why, how could I get my younger self to listen to me? Well, there's a two-part answer to that. I think of it as a carrot and a stick, like with a donkey. The stick is that doing this work well depends on being present, being thoughtful, being in the moment. If you end up feeling numb, picturing yourself as a rescuer and becoming cruelly disillusioned or helpless, being chronically ill, exhausted, involved in substance abuse, and so on, then the argument goes that you're not doing the work in a sustainable way, and you certainly can't be doing it well, whether in using your historical imagination in the archives, gathering and analyzing data in the field or in your office, or supporting clients and communities in your practice. So this might sound forbidding. It has been argued that vicarious traumatization is sometimes shown in overly extreme ways. And I think my story is fairly extreme. And we need a more moderate and sensible way to educate people. So now to the carrot, the plus side of forestalling or trying to forestall vicarious traumatization. And it's that in aiming to make your work more sustainable, you can cultivate and gain new skills, not just revert to your personal normal, not just use the resilience you've had all along, but become more resilient, differently resilient, growing in different directions. Post-traumatic growth in studies looking at this can be measured in terms of not only having less burnout or less vicarious trauma, but also greater satisfaction in your work, what's called compassion satisfaction, greater growth in relating to others, perceiving new possibilities, experiencing greater strength, spirituality, or appreciation of life. So what could self-care look like? One idea is to get routine checkups. You could consider using routinely the professional quality of life scale that was compiled by the Center for Victims of Torture. This scale comes up in several studies, and it's been translated into 28 different languages. There'll be a handout. All my best finds are in the references. It's important to notice, to name and express your feelings. Genocide and refugee studies researcher Ivana Macek, who does interview-based research, she's also been in the war zone, gives some gentle advice that during interview, if you're feeling shut off, notice it. It's protecting you somehow. But she says words are nice. It's good to have the words, but it's also important to have feeling, to be able, because communication is through our emotions and not only our words, through our bodies and not only our words. So folks like me, who are prone to shutting down when the feelings get too much, There's research demonstrating the value of labeling and not arguing with your feelings. It's the grown-up version of telling children who are upset to use your language. What is it that's going on? What's happening? Or there's value to practices like journaling, and of course the value of counseling and of consultation that are confidential, supportive, and trauma-informed, a term I'll be returning to. So I'm asking you to share, or suggesting that you share, but share wisely. A good ground rule, and this comes from Laurie Perlman of the Incest Survivor Therapy book. Good ground rule is don't start venting in casual experiences. Don't go down the hall and share with your colleague your little horror stories. I could tell you horrible things I read in the Nuremberg trial transcript. Actually, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about them. But what would that do? Just infect you with, with my horror. Instead, it was more useful to seek a supportive environment. Go down the hall and say to your colleague, I'm freaked out by what I just read or saw or heard about. I'm feeling really upset. I want to go drink a bottle of vodka, whatever it is that's going on with you. Talk about what's going on with you and don't infect other people with your dread. And when that sharing happens, call out beliefs like, the victims have it worse, I shouldn't complain. I'm only reading the literature, I should be fine. Athena and Douglas are in the field and I'm not, so what am I complaining about? If these kinds of beliefs are beliefs that are preventing you from seeking help, from recognizing what's going on with you, then they're not actually all that helpful. Set boundaries. My graduate school practice of not bringing genocide books home because it upset my roommate would be an example here. Other examples could include writing notes at the end of your interview or work sessions to try to close it off, doing something different between meetings with your clients, having leisure time, having a life, being intentional about who has your phone number, setting physical boundaries, writing this talk with many memories intruding. It helped to sit at a different seat at the table where I work. And I thought of it as that's the vicarious trauma seat and the other seats were not. Another boundary setter back from when I was teaching genocide studies was that I was once asked to teach it in the winter in Canada at 8:30 in the morning. And I went to the department admin and freaked out at them and said, like, there's no way I can teach this at 8:30 in the morning in the winter. Everyone's just going to be sitting there. Like, they're already not coming in a good mental state. Don't make me do that. And they did change. They did change my time. Seek renewal intentionally and frequently, whether that's through leisure, through nature, through social activism, through interacting with stories of resilience. The field of positive psychology, which took off in the late 1990s, promotes practices for flourishing, such as meditating, actively practicing gratitude, or intentionally tuning into the bigger frame of reference that feelings of wonder and awe bring forth in us. That's my personal favorite, the wonder and awe. We can see back to my statistics days, this graph of word use in the English language, books from 1900 to 2019, so 1900 at this end, 2019 over here, how words such as wonder, grateful, gratitude, and then lower down on here, but still on the upswing, awe, mindful, and mindfulness, all prominent in positive psychology, may be influencing our notions today of what self-care could look like. But do take this with a little grain of salt. Meta-analyses are starting to come out, examining whether these interventions necessarily assist people with depression and anxiety, whether they're better thought of as preventive things to be doing rather than restorative. And though I didn't go into these studies deeply, the results do seem mixed, which leads to my next point, which is that self-care cannot be one size fits all. People with acute vicarious trauma may not see the value of some common recommendations. For example, some people, like my mother, would enjoy doing activist work, but if you are like my father and think hell is other people, then maybe you'd prefer to go on a nature walk. And he did love his garden with a passion. Well, I think we've all got some wisdom from the pandemic, but what particularly worked for us, what didn't. Video games, sad to say, do not help, and what it was we longed for. Further, the stresses associated with traumatization can be experienced in culturally specific ways, and coping strategies likewise can be culturally nuanced. So in the references handout, Julia Mutamura's dissertation on war veterans in Zimbabwe is a terrific example on this, and the Ungar article as well. My last recommendation in this part is act like a career counselor. This includes acquiring a realistic idea of what a good outcome of your work can be. If your good outcome is, I'll stop all future genocides from happening, you're bound to be disillusioned and disappointed. Further, collect information on how careers in this field unfold. The idea that you'll do this for 40 years might be unreasonable. So start asking, ask around in your setting, how long do careers in this area typically last? And how do people pivot? I couldn't find any career longevity information for genocide researchers, but I did learn from a South African study that insurance claims workers who hear pretty awful stories typically last 4 years in that line of work. Trauma counselors typically last for 9 years. So start asking around just to see. And ask around what people pivot to. I know people who've gone from genocide studies to peace studies. That doesn't sound like a big shift to me, but to them it was wonderful and transformative. Gone into environmental research, gone into working for a publishing company and being the person who'd look at genocide books, but also medievalist books. And in my case, to narrative analysis. And develop a kind of plan B. If you can, have a side project at work or a teaching area of an entirely different nature, both to develop new skills and also for respite. So I think, teaching genocide studies twice a year was kind of much for me. Probably if I'd been doing it once a year, it would have been more okay. So I want to, for the last section of this, go back to the concept of self-care, the self in self-care. Despite the name, this isn't simply an individual matter. Ourselves are embedded in our physical environments, our social environments, our technological environments. So in the model of trauma-informed care, which was articulated in 2001, we know from that model that clients or research participants can benefit from organizations understanding that trauma is widespread. You may think you know who the people are who've had a trauma, but there's far more of them in the room than you know. So to avoid re-traumatizing people through our practice, we should be working with them in ways that are safe, transparent, and trustworthy. They respect their agency and are flexible and collaborative. When we conduct research interviews, we have ethics documents that are aimed at enacting some of these principles. But this model, trauma-informed care model, also means that if you are in a research team or center or group practice, it's essential for your organizational culture throughout to accord these principles. So it's not just, oh, my employee should work with my research participants in these ways. It's also my employer should work with me, the employee, so that I feel safe. I feel that my employer is trustworthy. I feel my agency and input are respected. So one of the recommendations I saw was to get self-care into your organizational mission statement. You could also try to get now the bigger thing, the trauma-informed approach into your mission statement. And what that could mean in practice, just a few examples, could mean leaders who model vulnerability, who show that we're not always expected to just tough it out. A colleague of mine recently mentioned at a department meeting that she'd had to abandon a project on truth and reconciliation in her home country. And I think her putting that out there was a kind of leadership. It can mean offering multiple options for support. If there's money, that could mean a benefits plan that pays for counseling. If there isn't money, that could mean a workplace book club that's reading about vicarious traumatization together. It could mean something like an independent consultant who's available for discussions of vicarious traumatization, and not having the supervisor who assesses your work and decides to hire or fire you be the only person you can go to and say, I'm not really doing all right. Can mean autonomy for your employees, about flex time, vacation days, sick days, and an organizational culture that encourages people to use them. It could mean a lower caseload or workload. Again, with the availability of trauma-informed supervision, it could mean choices about how many interviews to conduct, transcribe, or interpret in one day. It could mean options about the nature of the work, such as opportunities for professional education, coming to a workshop like this, which provides respite perhaps from some more intense aspects of your work. And also, during interviews, we can feel helpless. I don't know what to say or do next, because, and somehow this feeling of helplessness can be assuaged by going out and acquiring new skills to some extent. Could also mean asking what would make the work environment feel safer and more personally meaningful. And though there's further possibilities, I've only just begun reading in this area. I'd like to close with a picture of one of my inspirations for, as I wrote this talk, which was my bay tree. It's very small, but it's putting me in awe every day by reminding me with its new growth that it knows spring is coming. I don't know how it knew spring was coming, even when it was still freezing here in Toronto. It started sprouting and it's really beautiful. I love it, and I love to watch it flourish. I hope you all flourish in your work. Thank you so much. There's some references in a handout that other folks will be sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bishoping. And yes, we will be sharing the handout with everyone who registered for this session. So thank you so much for sharing those references with us. And thank you for being so vulnerable with us today and sharing your personal experiences and these incredible recommendations. I don't want to speak on everyone's behalf, but I know personally I learned a lot from this, and I'm going to take away some helpful tips for us at the Zorian Institute. So thank you very much for that session. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Douglas Matthew Mawardi. Douglas Matthew Mawardi is a Ugandan lawyer and human rights advocate. He is a founding director of Associates of Health Rights Limited, a nonprofit organization based in Kampala, Uganda, that advocates for the well-being of human rights defenders and vulnerable persons, providing and advancing peer-based support to vulnerable groups. Mr. Mawardi has worked with marginalized communities, providing legal and protection needs and extensive support, and has participated in strategic national, regional, and international advocacy projects. His recent work focuses on advancing the mental health and wellness of human rights defenders and digital inclusion in the advancement of human rights. He is also an affiliate of the Human Rights Resilience Project, organized by the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU School of Law. Today, Mr. Mawardi will be speaking about the increase in human rights violations against human rights defenders and inadequate government support and resources. He will also speak to the difficult position human rights defenders find themselves in without support for self-care. So, Mr. Mawardi, thank you so much for joining us today for this session. I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Zorian Institute, for inviting me to be part of this space. The beautiful Kathy and Athene as the co-presenters, and thank you so much for the opportunity once again. We are an organization that works in Uganda, and most of the people who we look up to in respect to consuming our services are human rights defenders, but also vulnerable communities. And to that extent, this topic really interests me so much, and I thought that this is really an opportunity for us to share our field experiences with you all, but also, to learn from also some of these engagements from the respective jurisdictions and regions where there's a lot of work going on around protecting persons, addressing issues of self-care, issues of trauma, issues of genocide, and many other issues that for us it's a learning experience, but also it's a new trend that is coming mostly from the incident of COVID, as Dr. Kathy had talked about. Today, I am simply just going to talk about some of the points I've talked about. I'll start with the context of human rights defenders. What are the contexts within which human rights defenders operate within our sets of operations? You may find that most of human rights defenders are persons who are very young. They are from the universities or institutions of learning, and to which they are simply looking for jobs or employment for that factor. So as such, they come to the field of human rights without an experience of what it feels like to work in human rights field. And as such, you find most people don't have the background of the background and experiences of the field. They are very fresh from the universities where they have been pretty much being protected by within the precincts of the universities or by their families. But this time around, you may find that they work in a very broad field where they get exposed to different groups of people, different categories of circumstances under which they are not used to. So that means people become much more exposed to multiple other factors to which they are not used. It's not an environment which is used because it's no longer an academic environment. It's no longer an environment that is family-based or any other things of the sorts, but you become a target for many other people, including governments. And as such, the context within which defenders operate are not necessarily informed by any academic view or whatsoever, neither any training. So many people find themselves into doing human rights work without experiences. And as such, many people get exposed to traumatic experiences because of their work, because of the environment, and also because of the circumstances under which they operate and work. And these are actually also informed by the organizations. I remember Dr. Kathy had talked about the situation under which people operate. And for us, it is simply to say that it is a learning experience. People get out there in the fields without any experience whatsoever, and they get to interface the difficult situations without any background whatsoever. So basically, that's the context within which many people operate. And while people continue to do human rights work involves quite a number of things. Among others include, for example, people are documenting human rights situations where, for example, people are arrested, people are detained, people are evicted from their places of residence, people don't have food, people don't have less medication, for example, where someone is, for example, if I may give an example where someone has been raped and someone is bleeding, and these are first-hand experiences of human rights defenders where you have to step in the position of a parent or in the position of an authority to make sure that this person gets medication, this person gets to be attended to by the police. You need to start looking for the perpetrator of this of the victim. And as such, this is it is an experience which is first-hand, whereby most people are exposed to, and to which they don't really have that kind of a background. And as such, there's some of these violations. I've just talked about evictions from places of residence, being laid off from their places of work, being attacked and beaten, because of either being their sexual orientation or gender identity, which of course is something that is criminalized in Uganda, and these are the contexts within which we operate and whatnot. These instances dehumanizes people. Dehumanizes people in the sense that when you're evicted from one house, it is extremely very difficult for one to find another house in the neighborhood, or even it can be within the region. So that means you need to move in a little bit of a far distance, where it also becomes a challenge to know where, like, if one doesn't have any source of income in that new place of where they may have shifted to, one may not have had any individual whom they know and a friend to which they can live or stay and whatnot. So some of these human rights violations that I talked about, it dehumanizes people. It puts people into limelight to which they are known into other multiple places where they also get exposed, and to which ones when they ask for some support in terms of accommodation, in terms of shelter, in terms of food, in terms of employment, they are always denied these chances to work in these places or to even like settle in these places. As such, the level, every single instance, whenever there's a human rights violation, it dehumanizes those individuals who are pointed out. If I may very briefly talk about the marginalized persons that we work in, we work with the LGBT community, we work with the sex workers community, work with persons who are injecting drugs, and these are individuals, first and foremost, they are, by their own very nature, they are societal rejects. They are not necessarily part of the society that they feel, the society rejects them, and the society does not feel that they should stay with people of this nature because they're considered socially immoral. They don't have their part in the society, and they are considered to be persons who are trying to tarnish the image of the cultural setting within which they come from. They're trying to tarnish the image of their families. They're trying to tarnish and change around the religious and the cultural settings within which people live and believe. And as such, these are contexts within which such communities find themselves in. And as human rights defenders, we also have to step in to provide such persons with support, support being legal aid. You know, you have to go to police, make sure that whoever has been detained is either released, or you apply to courts, you apply for a bond at court and things like that. So the violations dehumanizes the individuals. It also puts human rights defenders at risk, because even as a human rights defender, even if you are a lawyer and you are doing your thing, your professional work, you are being considered as a person who is encouraging people to become LGBT persons, transgender persons, and as such, it also dehumanizes your profession as a profession, because even if beyond a lawyer, there could be like some of my colleagues that work with professional psychologists. They provide clinical support, psychosocial support, and things of the sort. And these individuals who actually get clients who identify as sex workers, who identify as LGBT persons, and as such, they, even within their own settings, within their own workspaces and things like that, they are being dehumanized by their own persons. They tend to lose some clients because they have other clients who do not agree with the other client whom they have just seen before and things like that. So this kind of violation that actually do occur and do take place, to which people lose their human nature, they're dehumanized and things like that. The other thing also, just very briefly, before I leave the point of violations, is that the context within which minority groups operate in Uganda, for example, like we have just, we came out of elections in 2021, and one of the critical points which really has to explain were that during that time, the LGBT community or any organization that are providing services to the minority groups are looked to be as opposition. They are not government aligning, and as such, definitely your space of operation is shrink. You have a limited space of operation. That's one. Two, you are being monitored in terms of whom do you operate, who are your funders who are giving you money, what are those press statements that you release, who are those immediate political supporters that you work with, and things like that. And as such, colleagues are being arrested, detained. The civic space is shrunk for them because they don't have that kind of an environment to operate. And as such, all these factors do dehumanize, but also it limits the space, the operational space within which they can express themselves. And of course, freedom of expression is one of the key tenets mentioned in our constitution, but there are circumstances under which you are not allowed to express yourself because you are seen as a societal reject. The society does not necessarily agree with most of the points that you have to talk or discuss, you know. So in other words, you don't have any other issue to talk to the public about, because you are considered a minority group, and as such, whether you are a legal representative, whether you are providing psychosocial support for them, whether you provide any other social services for them, that is really not necessarily your space. So the space pretty much it's left for the political actors to play around with who has the space, who has the platform to discuss what issues, and even if you have an issue to put across, your issues are always being sieved and not necessarily given space in public discourses. The shrinking spaces for operation I've talked about very briefly, but also beyond and over and above that is that most people find it very difficult to raise resources, raise revenue, or raise money rather, to be able to operate, to be able to get office spaces, to be able to speak about what affects them in an open platform that actually gives them that platform to operate, to be able to articulately, you know, organize an association and things like that. So, and further to that is that also the Bureau for NGOs, which is the bureau where most organizations do register and give it licenses to operate, has an attitude of monitoring your operations, of course, through the regular return that you need to file, annual return that you need to file, or they call you to their offices to explain the factors within which you get engaged. And as such, this kind of instances it shrinks your operational space. So most of the organizations that are providing support services for most marginalized communities, they have had to operate from homes. They have had to have their offices closed. People had to, you know, operate from other spaces as opposed to office, because the office space also becomes a risk, because the minute you're there, you never know, the police may come and arrest you. So all this led to issues of like, how do we continue to operate normally without necessarily have our spaces, you know, monitored, you know, surveilled and things like that. So it leaves people thinking every single time a human rights defender steps out there, they think about very many factors. Will I safely get out there and safely come back home? If I'm arrested and detained, how will my families continue to survive? You know, so there are very many factors that goes into the minds of people because of the spaces for which they do operate. And also there is no particular government support, because every single time such issues happen, it is believed that the government as a whole believes that, one, you don't actually cooperate with the bureau which is in charge of monitoring your operational space. Two, even if your spaces are being ganged upon by other human rights organizations which are supported by religious or supported by cultural institutions, and because you're a minor group, you're always considered a person who is a minority, and you don't have that much voice. So your voice or your freedom of association, your freedom of assembly, your freedom of speech, and your freedom of simply defending persons who are minorities are not as you have it. It is as shrunk, and there's no that much of a support that is given to you. But also, there's no particular support in terms of like supporting the work of individuals who are doing minority works from the government directly. The government does not necessarily have a particular source of funding for such organizations, and also it actually looks into who are funding you. Why are they funding you? Are you providing services that are sanctioned by government, or the services that we provided are supported by Western government? So at times, some of the work we do are considered to be work or work of the Western government, but not work that are from within, you know, the region that will otherwise empower the people from within and give them that kind of a support to enable them to operate in their spaces. I'll lastly talk about inadequate self-care support. From my first point of the contextual framework under which human rights defenders operate, self-care support is really not necessarily a context within which organizations actually consider. I remember Kathy had talked about the organizations do not have self-care practices within themselves and within the operational space. And that is for us a lived reality. To the extent that we did a research right about before COVID, and also we did one after COVID. The one before COVID, we had 20 organizations that we did a survey with, and of the 20 organizations, only 4 of them had organizations that had self-care practices that they do give to their staff. And that clearly can give you an understanding to which the issue of whether or not self-care is a priority for organizations. Not forgetting that most of the people, as I said, are young people. They're looking for jobs. They don't have experiences of human rights. They don't have experiences of the field, and they get first-hand exposed to situations of this nature. And when they break down, because there's a lot of burnout, there's a lot of depression, there's a lot of exposure to traumatic experiences. I've talked about how every day you have to get out into the field, you have to document, you have to do advocacy, you have to engage other individuals to provide support services, you have to talk to parents, you have to talk to the police, you have to go to court and represent these individuals, some of whom are arrested. As such, each and every single step of the way is a traumatic experience. There are moments when I go out in the field, I literally stay the whole day without even having an opportunity to go to have like a decent meal. You are either, taking drinks that can sustain you for a few, hours and minutes and things like that. So all these experiences will lead to whether or not I have a self-care at the end of the day. So for us, I would say, just to conclude, is that the minorities that we work with in Uganda are really put in a very tight spot of genocide, a tight spot of trauma to which, because of their lived realities of the day, it exposes other people into the same lived realities as themselves. And as such, self-care, trauma are new trends that we're experiencing. And just to conclude that, I'll encourage such discussion to regularly happen in spaces. Now, lastly, if I may just talk about that, what do? We simply, because of the experience and because of the survey that we did of the 20 organizations, we created a very simple curriculum. This curriculum simply explains what are those common trends that human rights defenders go through. How shall we support each other? So we have started supporting each other through what we call peer-based system, where we tend to give ourselves support. We created a curriculum that supports communities, and we also have regular meetings, mostly on Fridays, to check in with each other. So we call it like circles, we call it regenerational circles. So through the regenerational circles, we tend to check on with each other like every week to find out what is happening. We support each other, and we also share experiences of what one may have gone through and how best we can support each other. But also through the circles, we also tend to identify a few support systems where a few individuals would come and say, hey, there's this organization that gives psychosocial support services to a few individuals without any pay, but also if the referral networks are not very functional, at times they may ask for a little bit of a pay that makes us to look around and see if we can avail some of these resources. So with that said, I thank you so much, and I yield the mic to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Marwardi, for this really interesting discussion and this perspective that is new to me, and for your very honorable work that you and your organization do in assisting human rights defenders and vulnerable groups. So thank you so much for this presentation. We really appreciate it. So if you have any questions, please, I'll encourage you again to add them to the Q&A. And again, at the end of today's session, we'll address all the questions there. Our final speaker for today's webinar is actually one of our graduates of our Genocide and Human Rights University program, Dr. Athena Madan. Dr. Madan is an assistant professor in the sociology of health at the University of Victoria, British Columbia. Her teaching and research interests look at humanitarian medicine and as applied to intervention implementation. Her professional and scholarly expertise includes global health, capacity building, therapeutic governance, and intergenerational trauma and reconciliation, genocide and human rights, theories of change, rehabilitation of child soldiers, the militarization of aid, socio-political contexts of addictions, refugee mental health, and war. Dr. Madan has experience in more than 20 countries in 5 continents and has worked with Doctors Without Borders, the Carter Center, the UNHCR, the World Health Organization, grassroots NGOs, and provided anti-racist subject matter expertise to provincial governments. Dr. Madan will close today's discussion by addressing moral and spirit injury that may occur when working in extreme conflict and in humanitarian crisis settings. For those who have limited field experience, she will also address the emotional residue or impact that may linger when studying narratives of genocide. She will then share some tools for personal reflection and preparation for fieldwork and some considerations for self-care when support and prioritization for self-care are not in abundance. So Dr. Madan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Megan, for that introduction. And Kathy and Douglas, it was, I've been, the benefit of going last is I've been taking notes from some of the key lessons that you've discussed and implementing them into some of my key points so that there's some resonance, hopefully, between all three of us. Can you see my slides okay?
We're seeing just your desktop screen, not slides.
How's that?
There we go.
Okay, so I guess I'll just keep it on this screen. Let me pull the Zoom screen over here. Okay. So thank you for those opening remarks for both Kathy and Douglas, and I'm glad that you covered the institutional requirements or organizational responses to caring for employees who may be experiencing vicarious trauma and the necessity to have institutional support for self-care. As we move to our own individual spheres of practice, and based on my own field experience, I'm kind of giving, and I've curated this talk looking at what we can do as individual actors, taking in all of these sad stories or working in these contexts, and what we can do as individuals to look at individual level self-care and how this impacts our relationships. So that's kind of the scope that I'm looking at. And I do supplement this content with some pictures that I've taken in the field. And I have, and some of the important people who have influenced my journey. And so I recognize we've been sitting for a long time. So if you would like to stretch, please feel free and do that, because our bodies also absorb emotion and content. So you're holding a lot already. So please take some time to stretch and just recognize that breathing in and out is also self-care in this particular forum too. I would also like, every researcher has their own cause or their own story. As an applied researcher, I'm invested in global health and social medicine. And as a researcher, I'm also a yes person. I ended up going to places where opportunities were not necessarily popular. So I started out as a researcher in my master's degree, going to places where no social worker had ever been before, or where researchers were hesitant to go, or where people were too afraid to go. So it wasn't popular back then, and it's more popular now to do high-risk research. But at the time, I just said yes to people who wanted to work in difficult contexts and help people in need. So I started out more in the humanitarian sector, and then the humanitarian instances just got worse and worse and worse. So I'm recognizing that everyone has their own influences, their own stories, their own journeys, as Kathy and Douglas have both shared. So for the participants in this room, I would also like you, or in this space, I would like you to think of a person who may have inspired you or whose story is very sad that stays with you in your research or in your own field experience or in news stories that you have heard. And it doesn't have to be recent. And I'd like you to keep that in the back of your mind as we move forward in these few slides. Mine is Shamshad. I'll be mentioning him very briefly in the context of this conversation, and he has stayed with me since I was first in, I think one of my first trips to Afghanistan. He has stayed with me since that, or in my memory, since 2012. Also, as a researcher, I use photoethnography. So some of these pictures that you see will be pictures that I have taken as I've journeyed through different contexts in the field. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I am dialing in from Victoria, or the Chichen Itza lands of ancestors and families, and I'm grateful for the stewardship of these lands. I miss Toronto very much, so it's nice also to connect with to York and Zorian. So thank you for this invitation. Points I'll be covering today. These slides, I typically have less text on slides, but because of the limited time that we have, and these are for your own review, I'll give you the slide deck. I won't be covering much of, or I won't read all of the text on the slides, but I'll consider you to be able to more reflectively do that on your own after this webinar is over. But I will be discussing basically moral and spirit injuries. What are the what do they look like? What are the differences? When might you encounter them and why? For those who have limited field experience, we'll be talking about emotional residue when we're reading or studying narratives of genocide, echoing some of the content that Kathy has also delivered to us. And then from my own I've also worked with MSF, helping debrief people after they come back from the field and processing difficult content as practitioners. So some of the tools that I've learned over the years in providing these types of services, both as a mental health practitioner with others experiencing trauma, and also witnessing trauma as a practitioner in the field, personal reflection and preparation tools for research as well as field research. And then when resources are not in abundance, what can we do at an individual level for considerations of self-care and some of the personal characteristics that I think have been helpful for me over the years in fostering that resilience. So again, please welcome to any questions as well in the Q&A with the time that we have after. So a quick guide, again, I won't spend too much time on this theory. The blue text here is hyperlinked for your reference if you'd like to look up those references later. Moral injury is typically what I would tend to see, or what we tend to feel as researchers of genocide, the ideas of problems of transgression or impunity. It started out, or the concept of moral injury started out looking at mental health of veterans who were Vietnam soldiers, looking at systems failures, betrayals of what was right morally, betrayal by someone in authority who told people to do something that they knew was wrong in a high stakes life or death situation. It then evolved when we looked at veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan eras, looking at individual failures. And I'm highlighting the keywords bearing witness to or learning. I think that parallels what I imagine researchers of genocide might experience in their research, bearing witness to or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs, expectations, with lasting impacts that can extend to psychology, biology, spirituality, and then behavioral interactions with others. As a survivor of genocide, most often you'll see people who manifest, and there's an emerging body of literature within Black and anti-racism scholarship, as well as Indigenous public health physicians of Canada. There's one person who speaks quite largely of this, looking at a spirit injury as a lingering intergenerational problem of oppressions and state-sanctioned types of violence that continues to exact heavy material, physical, and psychological and emotional toll on racialized subjects. So it's the construction of, within Black and anti-racist scholarship, the construction of white purity, white supremacy within the Black racist and anti-racist scholarship, and within the Indigenous scholarship, looking at sanctioned denigration of devaluing and disconnect. So I'm only mentioning the theoretical differences between these two because as a researcher of genocide, we probably wouldn't necessarily feel the spirit injury directly, but we would encounter spirit injury, and that leaves emotional residue that is very sad, that has dimensions of impunity and injustice, which is akin to and parallel to moral injury, and moral injury recognizing that systems have failed to respond. The international communities have failed to respond. History can repeat, or history hasn't had resolution. So while there are differences, there is overlap between moral injury and spirit injury, and they are relational impacts, intergenerational impacts. And they have, I think Kathy had mentioned to us, numbers of symptoms or behaviors that also can be brought up as a result of encountering these failures, whether they be systemic or individual. They have an impact on emotional residue. How each indicates or how each presents, everyone, I always, whenever I talk about these topics, I have two questions. One, what does that look like? Two, how do I assess it? So I won't go into assessment, but there are scales for assessment of moral injury. Moral injury has not necessarily been, or it has not been recognized as a psychological condition within the DSM-4 or 5. So it has, there's a recognition in the psychological and psychiatric communities that it exists, but it is not a diagnostic criteria. And therefore, for people who are suffering from moral injuries, specifically veterans, it's really difficult to obtain mental health supports in any validated or insured ways for sustained support. So that is also an added level of impunity when we look at accessing supports in these instances. So yes, the two questions that you always get is what does it look like and how can I assess? So I will provide scales for assessment for your review later, but just very briefly, moral injury tends to be, and it can be internalized or externalized, but there tends to be difficulties trusting and problems with purpose, problems with self, and problems with others. And there tends to be a sense of guilt, survivor's guilt, even reading about sad stories, but situating ourselves in a location of global north, relative privilege, where we do not see or witness impunity. We do not see or witness deaths that are not good, and we are not victims of state-sanctioned violence. There tends to be, as a researcher or someone who's in the field working with others who are experiencing that on a daily basis, there tends to be a certain amount of guilt to not be able to do more. So those are the types of presentations or feelings that come up that I see frequently. And with my practitioner friends that we quite frequently discuss, that is probably the biggest casualty of our work. What each is and each is not. There's also, and again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, you have these sources highlighted in the blue text, but there is some discussion and overlap of PTSD with moral injury and historical trauma with spirit injury. So moral injury is a separate category from PTSD because typically PTSD is a fear-based disorder. The research is somewhat conflicted about that, but typically PTSD involves heightened levels of vigilance and anticipation of something that will happen. And it's typically a response to one traumatic event, whereas moral injury is a response to difficult ethical decisions and circumstances over which you have no control, wherein you are called to hold or to act information or action that is a betrayal of what you consider morally correct. Spirit injury and historical trauma are very similar in that there is an intergenerational component, but spiritual injury tends to be more instilled and relational to oneself, and historical trauma tends to be a psychological wounding, again, intergenerationally across generations, emanating from a shared experience of trauma. So there's less overlap between moral injury and PTSD. Spirit injury is a component of historical trauma, but there is some fine differences between the two. I'm focusing on moral and spirit injury today because one, we don't often talk about these types of concepts when we're looking at self-care, when we're looking at intergenerational trauma. But I think it's important to understand that moral injury and spirit injury really can impact a person's sense of purpose, as we heard in Kathy's own story, a sense of being able to contribute fruitfully, purposefully, and knowingly in ways that can sustain change. And I think as researchers involved in genocide research, I think we all are keenly aware of human rights and keenly aware of human suffering and wanting to alleviate suffering at the population level, and keenly aware of the politics that may play into that. And in some ways, we are not able to change political systems. And so these are things that we all internalize. So just for limitations of time, I won't spend any more time on what each is and what each is not on these theories, but you have these sources for your review. What I would like to move to is some epistemological tensions that are manifestations of spirit injury or relational injury, relational tensions. But by what I mean by epistemological tensions is when conducting field research, these are some of the things that you might see that can leave emotional residue that you may not be prepared for. And I think Douglas also mentioned this, as people are prepared to go into the field, they're thrown into circumstances with limited amounts of training and called to hold, if not solve, tensions that preceded them before they even walked into the room. So this is one particular vignette quote from one of my colleagues when I was in the Congo. He said, when my team came there to research some of the intergenerational impacts of sexual violence in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, he said, "You weren't there when the genocide was happening to us. You weren't witness to our suffering during those 4 years. And now you come to serve yourself from the pain of our genocide for the purposes of feeding your own professional scholarship. So this anger, people tend to react to this quote by being shocked at the type of anger that is articulated in this quote. Conversely, I look at this quote as expressing in a very articulate way the disconnect between academic research and the need to be connected to community. And the realities of the community also need to reflect and be reflected in the research. The humanity needs to be part of the research if we are to have any sort of meaningful change or understanding of the phenomenology of genocide and how to prevent it in the future. Something that Douglas was also mentioning in human rights and activism, I did a thought piece looking at treaties and human rights, international humanitarian law have limitations. And it's only when you have this shared sense of empathy, or at least as a researcher, I have come to feel that shared senses of empathy are probably just as important as those types of tools in order to sustain and effectuate change. So because everyone in North America likes a happy ending, I will just state for Justin that we still are colleagues, we still collaborate and do capacity building initiatives across the distance. And I welcomed that articulation of, yes, it was angry, but rightfully angry at pinpointing the disconnect between community and academic resources and the need to be able to model that vulnerability in a shared reciprocal way. I've got 3 quotes, and so this is the second of third. This is when I was a practitioner working with Emerence, who was 16. We were undertaking art therapy with a group of girls who had been victims of sexual violence, and so they were children of rape as a result of the DRC, the genocide in Rwanda spilling over to the GRC. And Emerence says, essentially, equity is more important to her than anything else. So there's nothing beautiful about the war in my country. I don't want to draw a picture of things I don't want to see anymore. Sometimes I felt like the researchers, only wanted to talk to me about what happened so that they, the white people, could feel better. Let me and my sisters, let us achieve hopes and dreams as equally as your own daughters. Only then will I be fine. Until then, I don't really want to draw. So again, a certain amount of anger, but articulating that equity is more important than innovation. Equity is more important than the interview, and recognizing that until we are able to have or impact geopolitical change, which fosters the ability for people to flourish and achieve self-determination as they realize it, we're going to have to hold those tensions. And then the last vignette, bringing back to my sad story that still stays with me to this day. Some of my fieldwork in Afghanistan, I'm reading now that in 2023, every day, 167 children die in Afghanistan, which is facing the world's most, the worst humanitarian crisis of our lifetime is happening right now in Afghanistan, and the international community is immobilized and helpless to stop it. And I find that very sad for me to hold. And given my time and efforts, in Canada, we have many people who have spent time investing in Afghanistan and recognizing that all of those gains are drastically being unfolded. It's very sad to encounter and to hold and to witness. Just if you're interested, my thought piece about Shamshad research in Afghanistan is here, more about epistemological tensions, being an external actor or being an outside actor, and then just having different geopolitical inheritances as a genocide researcher sometimes can be an obstacle. You can read more about it in this hyperlink in the blue text. And with respect to the 167 children stat, there's more from an article on BBC, which cites a Human Rights Watch report. So how do we hold all this? Some tools for personal reflection and preparation. You may also see this helpful article, which is, it's an interdisciplinary article where people talked about if you are preparing to undertake field research, here's a checklist to make sure that to ensure that you're properly trained, ready, and equipped to be able to be a fruitful contributor to the crisis. rather than being immobilized in your own sadness or in your own encountering of witnessing sad contexts. First, learning about or situating your own privileges. I mentioned earlier what political affiliations you represent take up space before you enter the room. When I was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo at the time, Canada was led under the Harper administration, and we had very particular funding or very particular political and funding opinions about Israel and Palestine at the time. And when I went to the DRC, many people were suspicious of Canadian involvement and interventions or projects because of the policies of the government of Canada funding Israel. So recognizing those affiliations and what you represent before you walk into the room is important. The reason why I cite this is because in the DRC, a lot of people at the time identified with people of Palestine with respect to how the international community didn't hear their concerns or felt abandoned by the world. So those political affiliations, in addition to my own social inheritance, being a woman or being having access to higher education, which most women in the world do not have access to. Actually, we're dialing in from Canada. So Canada is the per capita has the highest level of graduate education in the world, and specifically for women. So if you are a female researcher going out to places in the world, recognizing that access to education, yes, represents privilege, but also represents independence, represents the ability for you to pursue dreams and have equity on the world stage in ways that women who are in national women in particular countries won't have the same access. At the same time, if you are pursuing your education as a woman in your 20s and 30s, recognizing that you will not have the social capital of being a wife and mother that most societies around the world do have. And so recognizing the limitation of that social capital is also important for you to recognize to have culturally relevant conversations. Also, to echo something that Kathy said earlier, cultivate gratitude, recognize where life exists when you're reading about where life does not. Those small wins and perspectives can be very sustaining. Second, learn to critically self-reflect, do no harm, know that good intentions, wanting to share stories to the world, that's not enough, and employ culturally competent and relevant processes as you communicate with others. Third, as scholars, this took some time for me to realize throughout my PhD, learning to theorize anger. And it goes in with learning to advocate. So no good intentions, wanting to share stories to the world is not enough. You need to advocate, you're responsible. Once you've held those stories, there is an expectation that you are going to help change the circumstances that created those stories. That's just my experience of myself and others in the field. Even though you're a temporary actor, your responsibility does not go away. So grief, anger, and impunity can motivate individual as well as collective action. Theorizing your anger in an academic sphere can help inform change in policies and practices. There's a useful paper here from South Africa about that type of scholarship moving into social activism. And learning to theorize your anger and anti-racist scholarship was also very good in this way. But then also learning to advocate. As Kathy said earlier, model vulnerability, recognizing where your relative space of privilege is and where you are able to articulate the need for equity where others cannot is useful, but also retain your dignity. Advocacy doesn't always necessitate being in a bad mood, so don't send those emails telling people off. Don't look for the death necessarily all the time. I recognize that learning how to advocate has put me in a bad mood frequently a lot. Anti-racist scholarship does that for me a lot, but just recognize coming back to your own space of dignity and relationality, recognizing the larger context of how this is formed and what you're doing this for and who you're doing this for. Again, thinking of that person or that story in the back of your mind that has influenced your work. So this is my last couple of slides. Considerations for self-care when resources are not in abundance. I don't know, I guess I was reflecting on this when I was hearing Kathy and Douglas speak. I guess as a researcher, I've always worked in underfunded environments, and I tend to be not a solo actor. I've always had team members, but as a researcher, you tend to be fairly solitary in the work that you do. So first, you need to prioritize self-care. my mom gave me some advice a long time ago that no one's going to pay you not to take lunch. So in the same way when you're on a plane, you're responsible for your own oxygen mask. I recognize that that metaphor is not appropriate for all cultures, because in some cultures you will put the oxygen mask first on your child before yourself, but you're responsible for your own oxygen mask. If you're over 18, no one's going to do that for you. Also, take care of yourself. Your body absorbs tension. It is absorbing tension today, so please ensure adequate rest and exercise. For me, self-care also includes massages to release the tension that I hold, but I also recognize that's a very privileged thing that I have. So another thing, and I think Kathy also mentioned this, is community pathways to alternate care. This can include going for a walk in the forest. This can include sports groups. This can include helping people just in a communal way at the barbershop. There are alternate pathways to care rather than traditional psychotherapies. Fourth on this slide is practice self-compassion. For me, I learned over the years that I accepted a fairly dark sense of humor, and that was okay. And this also links back into something that Kathy said earlier: seek support and be wise in who you share your processing with. Not everyone is going to understand these contexts, sadly. For me, the work as a genocide scholar, as an applied researcher and practitioner in humanitarian contexts, such as Afghanistan, it changed my relationships. It changed who I was able to feel understood my world and whose worlds I was able to relate to. So seek support from those that you can connect to. You may not be able to connect with everyone, but stay connected with those that you can. And then 6, do something active that disengages your mind. It doesn't have to be extroverted. It can still be introverted, but do take breaks and do recognize that disengaging your mind to foster creativity is also fosters resilience. And the last 2 points: genocide research can be sad, but remember the people who have inspired you and accompanied you through that journey, however temporary, and honor those relationships. Shamshad, unfortunately, who you've seen in the last couple of slides, he was a casualty of one of those 81% of people, children who died in war, and I think about him every day. And he has helped inspire research that I do as a genocide researcher today. And last, also something that took me a really long time through my PhD, and I'm just now coming to this culminating point, is have confidence in your work. As a genocide researcher, sometimes people feel like it's a hopeless cause. Sometimes people read your work and don't understand the point of it. But recognize that your work is still about hope. It's not just about death, and you're not alone in pursuing it. So please have confidence in the work that you're doing. And when people say, so what about your work? Your work can influence policy, it can influence politics, it can influence how we view conflicts in the world. And that's also a start. Last quote that I've learned to encapsulate that is from a British economist. And he talks about, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. And I think I'd like to leave on that point today and share another story of a child. I did some work with child soldiers in Afghanistan, and this is Omar, who at the time was the same age as Shamshad, but he has since gone on. We have kept in touch intermittently. In the past year, he's been more quiet given the situation in the Taliban unfolding, but he started a DDR program, or a de-radicalization program, for child soldiers in Afghanistan, and he is still committed to doing that to this day. So yeah, hope is possible, and hope is still part of your research, even if you are still surrounded by stories of loss, grief, and death. So these are some of the references that I've mentioned earlier, and that's all for me. And I thank you so much for giving me the time to share some of my stories today. Oh, and here's my favorite go-to sign, my favorite go-to song in moments of stress.
Thank you so much, Dr. Madan, for that wonderful presentation and for these really useful tools. We will be sharing all of the resources with everyone after this presentation. So thank you so much for all the hyperlinks and for the videos and the articles as well. So we'll share those with everyone.